to do. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Hey, darling people, so I'll sing a little prayer, okay? Why don't we do that? But what it is, Tibetans say we should sort of start kind of with a good motivation. So we think we're going to just all listen to these words that I'm listening to coming from the Buddha about how to kind of navigate our lives, how to stay sane, how to be reasonable, how to develop our qualities, how to be helpful to others. And it's just really down to earth practical advice based upon this Buddha's view of the mind and how it works, you know. So we're going to talk about that why, so we can take some tools on the one hand to develop our own amazing potential, but because we live in this crazy world together, it also enables us to be a benefit to others. So thinking, there's this nice analogy, you see, that a bird needs two wings, wisdom and compassion. So we'll think like that. So we're going to see what we can take from this for our sake and the sake of others. I'll sing a little prayer in Tibetan that sort of expresses that. Sangye charang tsoke chognam la jangchu baru dagni kyab suchi dagi chonyen gipe sonam ki drola penchir sangye drumpa shog sangye charang tsoke chognam la jangchu baru dagni kyab suchi Dagi chunyen gipe sonam ki, drola penchir sange drupa shog sange, chedang soke chognam la, jangcho baru dagni kyab suchi. Dagi chunyen gipe sonam ki, drola penchir sange drupa shog. Okay, so it's interesting, even the question, that we should be considering, let's say, how to stay optimistic. It already implies something, doesn't it? It implies that there's a possibility we might not be. And then we should think, well, what would that be for? Why would that be? I suppose because we could say we live in a world that's difficult and, maybe politically we're not happy, maybe with terrible suffering. I mean, everywhere you turn, no matter where it is. I mean, look at Los Angeles right now, all these people, their houses burning in the middle of winter. You can't even imagine it, boiling fires in the middle of winter. There's always going to be something, and we see this since beginning this time in history, in human history. Forget animals, we always see that some, speaking simply, things seem to go wrong, meaning things don't seem to go all the time the way we would like them to. So we analyze that and look at that. What is it in us? We have to think about what is it in us that somehow makes us, always assume that things should go well, because that is the assumption, isn't it? I mean, you could argue the very fact that we get upset when bad things happen indicates we think they shouldn't happen. I mean, we could say we don't want them to happen, and that's one thing to look at. But I think the assumption that they shouldn't happen, I think, is a big one for us. And I think much of our suffering comes somehow it's wrong that bad things happen. So I think we should analyze that. And of course, if we take the Buddhist analysis, it's talking about the mind. And if we look at the mind in Buddhism, it's in one sense quite simple, although it's quite complex. It goes very deep. But the initial analysis is quite clear. That if we look into the contents of our mind, we can see, speaking simply, we have certain states of mind that we could call optimism, confidence, self-confidence, kindness, compassion, patience, all these things. And we sort of, as soon as we hear those words, we recognize them. And then when we know whether we're on the receiving end of them or whether they're within us, somehow we know they're good. And we know they're nice qualities. And as soon as we hear the other lot, attachment, fears, jealousy, depression, anxiety, despair, anger, arrogance, low self-esteem, you name it, we know they're horrible somehow. And so we can all recognize we've got all of these. It's very clear we're made up all of these. And I suppose you could say, if we look at the modern analysis of the mind, neuroscience and psychology, there seems to be an assumption that a normal person is made up of some of these. Hopefully some of the nice ones, better than the other ones, we can see that. But somehow we just assume a normal person would have a soup of these, So then if you look at the Buddha's view, initially it's quite shocking. Almost we can't hear it. It seems so shocking to hear. I remember one woman literally burst into laughter, and it's completely understandable because he has found from his own experience, and let's just quickly look at who he is. He's this person a couple of thousand years ago coming out of this incredible Indian tradition. I mean, I like to say this, it's only really now these days since the Dalai Lama has been around, and he's encouraged all these conversations with all the modern thinkers and scientists. And there's only now an interest in our culture in things Indian, you know, I mean, or Asian. I mean, in fact, we're very arrogant in our white Christian Judeo-European culture. We only really consider going back to the Greeks and all of that culture quite, you know, sort of real and serious, you know. But now I think there's an incredible interest in Buddhism, but even before Buddhism, these genius Indians that Buddha came out of, you know. I mean, the Dalai Lama always says that these amazing Indians more than 3,000 years ago, they were the ones who actually began the investigation into the nature of self. I mean, that shocks us because we don't think that's true. We think it's, you know, we think it's Mr. Freud who started the investigation of self 100 years ago because we're so centered on our European. I think so. So it's really very excellent that now we're looking into this, hearing about the Buddhist approach, certainly. But the Indians, this genius, they're these brilliant psychologists, thinkers, yogis, scholars. You know, they're the ones who discovered, who developed this extraordinary psychological skill that enables us to learn to access and become, I mean, phenomenally, intimately familiar with the workings of our mind. So we'll go, oh, well, we're good at that. That's called neuroscience. No, the radical difference here is, from the Hindu perspective and the Buddhist perspective, we're looking at the internal subjective process itself. We are not discussing the brain. That's not the discussion. And that's a big surprise because we assume that mind and brain are synonymous, but not for this tradition. And that's the big shock. So to take that on board here, I mean, you know, is already an interesting point as a hypothesis. And the point is, in the Buddhist approach, Buddha diverged in his own direction from from the Hindus, which is why we have Buddhism. And it was specifically in relation to his own very specific experiential findings about the nature of self, which is, you know, so the Buddha's expertise really is the mind. And that's a bit of a surprise to us because when we think of meditation or when we think of spiritual, we don't think psychology. But Buddha doesn't talk about a special extra little piece called a soul or a spirit or something. He doesn't talk like that. The Buddha's emphasis is on the mind. The difference is he uses that word to refer to the grosser level, conceptuality, the intellect, our emotions, our feelings, but these subtler levels as well. And when we can develop that brilliant technique that's known as shamatha in Sanskrit or calm abiding in English, coming from these Indians, is incredibly sophisticated skill that enables us to develop very, very subtle concentration at an extra special subtle level of mind, which quite frankly, we don't even posit as existing in modern psychology. It's not a function of the brain. And this is where we mystify it as soon as we hear that. But this is the approach. And so learning, you know, even if we don't go anywhere near that level of sophistication in our practice, still there's so much we can do. And the Buddha's simple point is that he has found that in the long term, and this is what he said he has achieved himself, that we are able to totally rid our mind of all the neuroses, all the fears and the ego and the dramas and all the unhappiness and the stuff that is clear causes us pain and separates from us from others, and is clear is the source of what causes other people to harm each other. I mean, look at the world. You don't kill and rape and torture out of love and compassion. It's pretty obvious, you know. And so Buddha's analysis is, his view is, from his own experiential finding, that all those neurotic states of mind, the voices of ego, if you like, he has found that they're not at the core of our being. I mean, it'll take us a while to get there. That's what nirvana means. You achieved your nirvana when you quite literally have done that job, you know, using this brilliant skill. So way to go. But well before that, there's so much we can do and there's so much benefit we can get from this approach. So if you take the idea, in other words, what he's saying is we're not set in stone. I mean, very common view, I think, in our modern psychological views, forget the neuroscientific one, is that when you have like trauma, for example, or really bad things happen, we just assume you really can't really get rid of it. We can't really change. And Buddha's view is completely, utterly not that, you know, that there's not a single part of our mind, our cognitive process, our subjective cognitive process, that can't be changed. And that's the basis of all of the Buddhist approach, which just itself is incredibly encouraging. I mean, I think, and without even learning it or thinking it or being taught you can't change your mind, well, I think we just assume we can't. I mean, that's why we panic when bad things happen, because so there's two things there. One, we just assume we're set in stone. And two, this is the other problem, is we're totally convinced, and this is one of the biggest analysis of Buddhas, we are completely convinced that what goes on in the outside world is the main source of our suffering and the main source of our happiness. It's a very simple point, And Buddha's analysis would say this is simply literally not true. It doesn't mean it's easy, but that's the whole point. That's the essence of the point. So even for us just to think that's possible, already that's encouraging. Already we don't have to be overwhelmed by the suffering, by the things that go on out there. But this is the challenge. But starting with the point that it's possible to change my mind, to start from the assumption that I don't have to be like a puppet or dragged from pillar to post by the outside world. This is the basis of Buddha's teachings, and this is what he says is possible. And all his presentation, his methodology, is what he has said he's perfected, and all he's doing is passing on to us what he has said he has achieved. So it's encouraging to hear that one human being has done it. Like if you hear that Einstein says you can, relativity is how things are, it's encouraging to think that a human being has looked into these things. So Buddha's the same, So it should be encouraging to us. And then you have to think, well, why would I want to change my mind? Why would I want to buy into the view that the outside world isn't the main source of my suffering and the main source of my happiness? Well, it's pretty obvious, because you can't guarantee that you'll make the outside world do what you want. It's pretty clear. I mean, we spend our lives, look at us. And this is not moralistic, by the way. We often hear spiritual teachings in a very punitive way. This is practical, This is practical. We know no matter how much we want certain things to be the way we want them, and how much we don't want certain other things, we know we can never guarantee. We can get what we want sometimes, we can change the world sometimes, but we know we can't guarantee it. And we know we can't change certain things. We can't live forever. We can't stop people dying. We can't stop people leaving us. We can't stop sometimes some people disliking us even. So it's really clear that we can't forcefully shape the world the way we want it emotionally. I mean, we can do a lot of things. We're genius at things like botany and mathematics and music. We can learn incredible internal skills that enable us to do all sorts of marvelous things with the world, which is the way we think in the West. That for us is the supreme way we can work. But the Buddha's point is we can change the mind. This is what's most powerful. So it should be encouraging for us, just that. But it's not easy because why? Because his view is that these mistakes, he would call them these neurotic, he would have liked that word, I think, these neurotic, I-based, fear-based, fear-based states of mind. As soon as they arise, there's like a panic attack, when things go wrong, anxiety, anger, jealousy, it's like the worst experience. When these arise, they seem like insurmountable. We feel, what do you mean I can stop being anxious? What do you mean I can stop being angry? It's like a joke, because they feel so powerful, like compelling, like as if there's no way in the world we can change. And why, very simply, is because they're habits. Okay, this as a point, it is helpful to hear the Buddha's analysis that our mind doesn't come from a creator. It doesn't come from mummy and daddy. It is not a function of the brain, and it can't just pop up out of nowhere. So it is useful to look at that point. We mightn't like to think about it too much, but this is the concept that Buddha's view is our mind comes from before and before and before. It's its own entity. It's not the handiwork of something else. And I mean, to go into detail in Buddha's view, that idea that we can be made by someone else, that our mind, our thoughts and feelings and emotions can come from someone else, for the Buddha, I mean, speaking in my ridiculous way, is a very wacky idea. It's kind of weird. But we're so familiar with this view, and we're so used to the materialist scientific view that, yes, your mother gives you a brain, and indeed she does, but the Buddha would say she doesn't give you love and compassion and kindness and intelligence and being good at music or football. They are not a function of the brain, and that's what's being looked at now more and more in the modern world. I remember, I always quote this. I remember when I was working on Lama Zopa Rinpoche's book, How to Face Death Without Fear. And of course, it goes into the concept of death and rebirth and all these kinds of things. And while I was editing that book, I read a book by an American medical journalist called Nick Teresi, and it's called The Undead. He's a very funny fellow. His expertise is death, actually. He said people think he should be depressed, but he's always very funny. And he's in the medical profession. He's a medical journalist. And it was undead, and it's not about zombies. It's all about the problems and contradictions and difficulties in the American medical profession now in relation to the business as a result of the whole profession of cutting out organs of dead people and handing them to new people. Nothing wrong, marvelous. But a lot of problems have come of this. I mean, for example, they're not really so clear now about when death is. For example, he had a whole chapter on people who have out-of-body experiences, which are absurd from the medical point of view. It's not possible if you're unconscious to see what's going on during your operation, but all these reports, and people hear about this. We know over the centuries in all cultures there are reports of people, quote unquote, coming back to life after they're technically dead. I mean, there's many different things that are now forcing modern people to really reassess when is death. And I remember one doctor who's in this business, he's quoted in the book as saying, I can now say with certainty that consciousness is not a function of the brain. I don't know what it is, but I can say that. So I think it's marvelous that we're now looking at these things. I mean, of course, and the fact of the matter is this view of consciousness not being physical, the view of karma and reincarnation, have been around for 3,000+ years, only just because it's not our view, we think it's a load of rubbish, but we're so arrogant, of course. So anyway, never mind. But so of course, the key point that Buddha's making is why these tendencies are so strong is because we've come programmed with them, not from our mummy and daddy, not from a creator, but from our own past practice of them. And so whether I mean, and this is an interesting point for the Buddha. I look up on YouTube sometimes those little children who are musicians. You see these 3-year-olds, 4-year-olds playing unbelievably sophisticated music like Bach or Chopin. You can't believe your eyes. You just can't believe what you're seeing. This child playing this incredibly sophisticated Western classical music. And there's no way in the universe we can explain it in the West. This is not possible. Equally, you have a child who shows psychopathic tendencies. We don't like to think a child could do that, but we see it. You see, I mean, so in other words, the Buddha's view is you come into this life with habits. This is the whole view of karma, whether it's to kill or to play piano or to be loving or to be angry. So that's the assumption here. And this is why these habits are so strong. And we look into our own mind, forget, whether we're a pedophile or not, we're looking at ordinary habits, attached to food, angry, depressed, anxious. We recognize we've had these tendencies as long as we can remember. We can see it. Our little personality hasn't changed that much since we're tiny babies. Because Buddha's view is we come into this life programmed already with these tendencies, So that's helpful to even consider, which of course is explaining why they're so hard to change, why they seem what we would say is utterly instinctive and therefore utterly natural. I mean, my mother did not have to teach me to be angry. It's clear. I knew how to do it. I was very good at it. You understand? Some people are good at piano. I was good at anger. So we can see this, So this is why they're so hard, and why also we then say that they're natural. And this is a really powerful point. When we say something's natural, I think what we mean is you'd be unnatural if you didn't have it, Like anger is natural, jealousy is natural, anxiety is natural. So insofar as they are, in the sense that we've all got them, but this is the point that Buddha's making, which, as I said, should be encouraging to us, not punitive, is that they're not. His point is they're not at the core of our being. The Buddha's view actually, and it sounds a bit esoteric, is that actually the virtues and the goodness and the wisdom and the compassion and the kindness, these qualities are at the core of our being. They are actually what define us, and they can be developed to an incredible degree. And the other lot that cause pain and suffering, they are not at the core of our being, and they can be removed. That's finally what nirvana means, honestly. So it's very interesting to think of this, to hear this. So then we should look at why would I, and it's sort of fairly evident why we would like to be less angry, depressed, and jealous, and more loving and patient and kind, because we can see how we feel. I mean, there's something too intellectual. We all know if you talk about a person, a person who's kind, intelligent, and patient. You don't go, oh, how disgusting. You're happy to hear about that person, you know. I mean, and so we know those qualities in ourselves when they prevail, forget what they cause us to do to others. They make us happy. We feel good. So it's the most basic point, really. And we're not to be all kind of, forget about discussion of compassion. There's two wings of the bird, the wisdom wing and the compassion wing, in the way that all the Buddhist teachings are structured. The compassion wing, where you literally do then, really focus on growing, extending yourself beyond yourself to benefit others, that's actually more advanced. The wisdom wing is where you have to put yourself together first and know your own mind. And that's why the very first teachings, the Four Noble Truths, what suffering is, what causes it, all that's the nuts and bolts of the Buddha's explanations that we would use to put ourselves together, to understand ourselves. And it's on the basis of whatever level of success at the wisdom wing that we're then able to go and to be of benefit to others. So it's a very logical and progressive kind of presentation psychologically. It mightn't be so evident to us that it's that, but as we become more familiar with the Buddhist teachings, we can see that. So one of the things that's interesting that is not immediately evident to us, but which is really central to the Buddhist psychological view, is why the unhappy emotions cause so much suffering is because they have a component. There's many terms. The typical term, if you read Buddhist psychology, when you refer to attachment, anger, anxiety, whatever, the term that they use in Sanskrit, I think, and in Tibetan is the word affliction. Mental afflictions. And it's a very dramatic word. We don't use it. I think it's not a word we use much in our modern day. Affliction, But there's another word that is a synonym, but it's got a different approach. And this is the word I want to concentrate on. It's the word delusion. That anger, attachment, jealousy, and all those voices of ego have this characteristic, and that's what I want to discuss here, that causes, when they're prevailing in our mind, what they cause is that the thing we're relating to, the person, the event out there that we're freaking out about, these delusions, these afflictions, what they do is, as Lama Zopa says, okay, I'll say it first, then I'll say what he said. These states of mind, they're painful, they're distressing, but they also have this very specific characteristic of distorting our mind so that the thing and the event and the person actually appear in a distorted way. I mean, that sounds a bit peculiar, But let's analyze it. I think we can really see this is true. And this is the meaning of why this word delusion is so good, because this really gets to the heart of, from the Buddhist point of view, of why these states of mind are the problem. They don't just make us feel bad, but they literally misrepresent the world to us. So we know when someone says to you, you're really delusional. I mean, it's a good word in English. We know what they're suggesting is that you're not in touch with reality, and it's very insulting. But I can't stress to you enough, but this is absolutely bullseye for what Buddha means when he says that anger, attachment, jealousy, anxiety, low self-esteem, arrogance, you name it, that they have their afflictions, they're painful, but their key function is that they are in themselves, they label them delusions, but they cause us to be delusional. And we can prove it to be true. We mightn't think of it like this, but we're all delusional, Buddha says. It's just a question of degree. The degree that we have attachment and anger and all these neuroses is the degree to which we're not in touch with reality. And when we can get this, we are really, really in touch with the actual way that Buddha describes why we suffer, It's very interesting. And of course, this comes later in the more advanced stages of Buddha's teachings on the compassion wing, when we learn about when we learn the six perfections of the Bodhisattva, and the very last of those, which is really a component of the wisdom wing, and that's the teachings on emptiness. Everything in the entire Buddhist path leads us to that one. It's leading us psychologically, progressively, to get to the point where we finally get to the root delusion, the root nonsense, the root affliction, the one such that when it is removed, and that is perfected, that's the accomplishment of nirvana, you know. So Buddha's general point is, in general, yes, having anger and attachment and jealousy and this root delusion, we can refer to it as colloquially as ego grasping. They are painful. They cause so much pain, but their real function is they cause us to be out of sync with reality. And that really is the approach that Buddha takes in his assessment of literally why we suffer. It's in the mind, and these delusions are the cause of why we suffer and why we harm others. So on the face of it, that's a bit shocking. I mean, who would have thought our suffering comes from our own mind? It just is like a joke, you know. And so just even to get past that initial point, which comes at the very beginning stages of practice, when we learn about karma, Buddha's understanding of, you know, of his analysis of why good things happen and why bad things happen. And his whole view, you know, is that, as His Holiness the Dalai Lama says, this concept of karma, this natural law of cause and effect, it's like self-creation. That's where Buddha would argue that we do not, our mind does not come from our parents. Our brain does, our body does, our chemicals do, our DNA does, yes. And we certainly, there's no role for a creator. Buddha would just not, he's not just throwing out the concept, he actually argues with it and says it's a misconception, you know. Anyway, so it all comes down to one's own mind. So how is it that attachment, for example, even just anger, I mean, attachment's harder to understand it because we use the word in a different way, but just say anger. Anger, even when it's mild, you know, polite words like annoyance, irritation, upset, frustrated, they're just mild anger. That's all they are, and I'm going to explain. But even when they are in you, you know, you come down, you come to the kitchen, you live with your husband, let's say, and that you come to the kitchen in the morning and he's slurping his coffee again. So it's something as simple as this. I always use a simple example. There he is slurping his coffee, and instantaneously, you mightn't scream and yell and say you're angry, but immediately your mind is disturbed, isn't it? And you say you're irritated. It upsets you, it irritates you. You mightn't say that's frustrating. It's frustrating if the light doesn't turn green, but it's the same thing. You're annoyed, frustrated. So what that is called anger. Meaning, how dare he do that? Meaning, how dare he do what I don't like? Because that's really what it's saying. So when we understand, so then what I'm saying is that even that small moment of slight irritation, what it does is exaggerate that particular event. Now, one day you might come to the kitchen in the morning and you're not feeling upset. So there he is slurping his coffee, and for some reason today you don't mind. But tomorrow you're very fragile, and suddenly it appears bad. So that's really logical proof that that moment of aversion or anger or annoyance in your mind, it made the object bigger than it was. Our mothers would tell us that we make mountains out of molehills. We have this kind of, you know, our cultural wisdom coming from our great-grandmothers and things. And we all know this. You know, when you're annoyed, you're making a mountain out of a molehill. You know yourself, if you suddenly get upset about something and then you calm down, you feel embarrassed because you realize you did in fact make a mountain out of a molehill. Well, that's literally what the delusions do. So attachment, so okay, the two main, as we all know, if you read Buddhist teachings, you're going to talk about the three poisons. It's a very cute phrase, the three poisons. And Buddha, in fact, talks about 84,000 neurotic states of mind, but they all subsume to these three. It's kind of a very coherent presentation, you know. And all these neurotic states of mind have this particular function of distorting the event, distorting, exaggerating, embellishing. That's the point. Now, and that's why they're called delusions. they cause us to be delusional. So in other words, not be realistic. It's the simplest way to put it. All of this is really leading us to emptiness, which is the key, the final, the subtlest, the most primordial misconception, affliction. And this way we're talking now is usually the way they talk when we're trying to understand emptiness. But in the earlier stages in the wisdom wing, when we're discussing the emotional afflictions, the main emphasis usually is on the pain that they cause. But if we look a bit deeper, we can see that this is the wisdom aspect, actually, that attachment is a painful state of mind, but it actually it distorts things. So when you're strongly attached, even to something simple as the chocolate cake, we can see really clearly how this attachment in our mind, when it's prevailing, causes the cake on the plate to appear, in this case, not ugly, but extremely delicious. So we just take all this for granted. Oh, I love chocolate cake, we'll say, get all excited and anticipate it. So this means we have to understand this attachment, because this attachment, not the way we use it in our culture as an equivalent of being close to somebody, it's the key, basically the key neurosis, the main voice of the root one called ego grasping. And as far as the Four Noble Truths are concerned, effectively, it's the main cause of suffering in daily life, which is a bit shocking, but this is his analysis. I've got to look into it. But the key function is it distorts everything, and that's why it causes so much pain. So attachment exaggerates the deliciousness of something, but there's more flavor to it, because what attachment comes from in here. It's multifaceted. Its main energy is dissatisfaction. I'm not enough. I don't have enough. No matter what I've got, it's not enough. It's always this default assumption that somehow what's there isn't enough. So then it causes this emotional hunger, which is sort of the main energy of attachment, always wanting something more. And then when it's there, coming from this emotional place, it causes the cake or the boy, or whatever the object might be that you're hankering after, to appear much more delicious than it actually is. Now, we have this experience every single day, but we never join the dots. We just never join the dots. And when we can, it's a revelation, because it's proving Buddha's point. So these states of mind basically lead us up garden paths. They literally misrepresent the world out there back to us. That's how they say it. As Lama Zopa says, these neurotic states of mind decorate on top of what is there, layers upon layers of characteristics that just aren't there. So because this emotional hunger is there, you're feeling you haven't got enough. So then you hanker after the cake, then you visualize the cake and you get the cake, and then all the anticipation comes, all the expectation, all this is a function of attachment. And also working overtime. Then you can't wait to get the cake in the mouth. That's where it belongs. And all of it is driven by this absolute belief that when I get the cake, I'll get happy. It'll take away that pain of dissatisfaction, In other words, it's like really attachment, really quite accurately, attachment really is the mind of a junkie, and Buddha is, or addiction. We only think addiction is way over the other end. We're normal, but some people have serious addiction. It's true. But Buddha would say attachment to any degree is addiction, is this painful emotional hunger coming from the assumption I'm not enough, I don't have enough. All of which Buddha says are completely inaccurate. This doesn't say, he's not denying we feel it, but he says the habit of these states of mind causes us to feel all these things, and then we believe these stories. So when we're seeing that cake, everything in our being believes attachment's story of it is right. And so the Buddha's saying this, he says, and this is easy to prove, but we don't like it, that if attachment is a valid assessment of the cake, that it will bring you happiness, and then the more you eat it, the happier you'll get, because that's the logic. If it really is the cause of and this is the business of both the delusions being exaggerating and the point of the outside world being the cause of your happiness and your suffering, because we believe the cake is the cause of the happiness that we know is triggered when the cake gets in the mouth. So then the Buddha says, if cake is the cause of happy feelings, the main cause, the main cause, the main cause, then the more you eat the cake, the happier you will get. Well, we know that's not true. And this is the proof that it is a delusion. It shows us, it causes the cake to look like the cause of my happiness. And what comes when you keep eating the cake is the exact opposite. And that's, the more you eat the cake, the happiness goes down, and eventually it turns into you want to vomit. So we know this is true. And all the experiences we have of what we call happiness, there's nothing wrong with happiness. Happiness is not a delusion. All the experiences we have of happiness, we believe the only way we can get them is by getting contact with an external object, a person, a cake, a thing, in other words, the objects of the five senses. This is our complete addiction. And Buddha's not being moralistic and says you can't have cake. He's simply saying our expectation is, our viewpoint is mistaken. We are delusional. It is not accurate. And this is intensely difficult to see, but I think we can prove it even a little bit. So then you think, well, how can I get rid of that attachment? It's so primordial. How can I get rid of anger? It's impossible. What are you talking about? How can I stop being anxious? Because the habits are so powerful. But the Buddha's analysis is that it's possible. And that's why we have to develop this concentration, have this brilliant technique called shamatha, even some semblance of that can begin us on the right track. So when we start to get in touch with our mind and we start to see these particular states of mind, we're not discussing the good qualities here. We're not forgetting about those. But, if you've got a garden that's not working, you can't just say, oh, I only want to look at the flowers. You've got to see what's not working in the garden, and you've got to stare it in the face, and it's called the weeds. So you've got to learn to analyze the weeds as much as we don't want to. Then when you know the weed's nature and you start pulling the bloody things out, now you can grow your flowers. And that's why the compassion wing, which is the development of virtue and goodness, that comes second. You've got to pull the weeds out first, do the messy work, This is really true. So when we can even know that we can start to learn about these states of mind, first theoretically, because this analysis is quite specific to the Buddha, Freud didn't teach this. So when we start to learn this analysis and then use that analysis to see our mind, and we can then verify that analysis does seem to be right, then we can start to have some confidence that we can change. So it's going to be a while before we get rid of them all. That's your nirvana business. Don't hold your breath. But there's an awful lot we can do well before then. But the key one is to have this confidence, that we've got the potential to kind of reconfigure our mind. So one of the things here which is difficult for us, is I think in our culture, we give a lot of power. We talk a lot about feelings. We really think feelings, I'm not being sarcastic at all, are really everything. And when we think thoughts, we point up here and we think that's all intellectual. Then we point here for feelings and we think we've got to get in touch with our feelings. Everything's about feelings. But what's totally fascinating from the Buddhist analysis point of view, that all these emotional feelings we have, attachment, anger, love, jealousy, the positive and the negative ones, that we call them feelings only when they get to the level of our body being involved. Because we're so addicted to our bodies, we make the body the boss. We don't ever pay attention to what's happening in our mind before they become feelings. In other words, before they get to the surface of physically impacting, shaking, or you're depressed and you're inert and can't get out of bed, or you're feeling you're anxious or you're angry. So we only really notice what's in our mind when they become feelings. And the Buddha's point is, when we start to develop a concentration meditation technique, we can start to listen to what informs those feelings before they get to the level of the feelings. And that's where you start to really hear the conceptual story that attachment is, that anger is, that anxiety is, that jealousy is. We only know them at the level of feeling, but once we start to become familiar with our mind, we start to hear the conceptual, all the script in our mind. And that script is all these conceptual thoughts. They're conceptual thoughts. They're conceptual, like viewpoints, opinions. Anger is an opinion. Attachment is an opinion. Jealousy is an opinion. Love and compassion are opinions. They're all conceptual thoughts. This is very surprising to us. Buddha's analysis of the mind, we've got sensory consciousness, and then we have mental consciousness, and that's where the workshop is, as Lama Zopa says. And that's what's happening in our head from the second we wake up until the second we go to 1,000 thoughts a second. We don't pay attention, as I said, until they rise to the surface as emotion when our body is involved. And that's when we start to pay attention. That's when we go to the therapist. But that's a bit late. I'm sorry. I use the dumbest example, but it's so true. It's like you've got a nice car, but you've never heard of mechanics. You've never heard of such a concept. So you drive it and drive it and drive it, never pay attention to anything. And then one day you're on the freeway at 120 miles an hour and suddenly the wheels are falling off. Oh, my wheels are falling off. What will I do? Nobody's wheels ever fall off because we know about mechanics. You listen to the wobbling, and the second there's a wobble, you fix it. So nobody's wheels fall off in cars. But we are emotional. We don't pay attention until we're about to kill somebody. The commonest question people have, when I'm angry with my husband, meaning it's come to the surface, what can I do? That is like asking, what can I do when my wheels are falling off? It's a bit late. So learn from it, damage control, but this is the point. This is the skill that the Buddhist techniques give us because they are such brilliant experts at the functioning of the mind at a much subtler level, that if we can learn some focusing, even for 5 minutes, you mightn't get much focus, don't worry, but you're training yourself to stay on your boring old breath, and you can't help but hear the chatter behind. Don't think that's bad. It's good. Because you've got to become familiar with your own mind. We think meditation is all about making all thoughts go away. That's ridiculous. We've got to become familiar. It's sort of like you don't want the weeds to all disappear. You've got to become familiar with the weeds. You've got to see their nature, understand their function. Then you can start to work with them, you know. But at least, so then we have to learn with a bit of meditation. Then after the 5-minute session in the morning, you go to the kitchen, whereas normally you just vomit out your angry words to your hubby. Now, because you're practicing stepping out of your head for 5 minutes, you're noticing the little angry thoughts before they get to the mouth. You're noticing the wobble before the wheels fall off. That's the skill we have to learn. But of course, we don't like listening to our thoughts. We just think, but we have to have that. We have to have that courage, you know. You can't just make all your thoughts go away. They won't. They're powerful energy. And we've got to become familiar. And we all know when you start to do a spiritual practice, start to do any therapy even, you start to be aware of the garbage in the mind, and it's scary as hell. But we've got to have the courage to want to become familiar. Like you can't just look at your garden and hope the weeds go away. You've got to dig in deep and get your hands dirty. Like a friend of mine who's a therapist is it's like putting your hands in your own shit. This is really true, you know. That's the courage we need, not just to think meditation is to make all your thoughts go away. That's just pathetic, you know. So when we become familiar with the stuff that's causing us pain and unpack and unravel these conceptual thoughts that become emotional when we don't pay attention, then, you know, then we can start to work on our minds, I tell you. They say in the texts, I mean, Pabonka Rinpoche, one of our lamas, in one of his classical texts, a presentation of describing the 9 stages of the stages of cultivating single-pointed concentration, shamatha. He says the sign of success at the first of the 9 is that you think your mind's getting worse, and that's all what happens. But it's not. You're just beginning to become familiar with this mind of ours. You know, I mean, we are only familiar at the at the tip of the iceberg of our mind. The Buddha's analysis of what the mind is mind-boggling, you know. I mean, unbelievably fascinating, actually. It's astonishing. So we have to have the courage to want to look into our minds so we can become familiar with what's there without fear, know we can learn to be our own, you know, to be in charge of it, not be victims of our mind. And already that's powerful. Already that's powerful, you know. Then we can have more courage in the face of problems because we know we don't just have to be like a little lemming and have a panic attack. It takes time, but this is really true, I tell you. And then you can say you really have less trauma. Because what trauma is, I think, is just simply undealt with dramas. As a little girl, bad things happen. We're not equipped to deal with it. So we push it down, you know, but it's got to come up. I mean, the Buddha's view of the mind, one approach is there's not a single thing we've ever seen or heard or thought about or tasted or touched or smelt that has ever gone astray. Everything is stored in our mind, every tiny experience. So we suppress so many of them because we don't know how to deal with them, but they're going to come up at some point. So the more we can get in touch with what's there, but also as we do this job, when bad things happen, because we're becoming more courageous, we'll be able to look it in the eye, even just the slurping of your bloody husband's coffee. You start with the small things, okay? You, instead of resisting it, resenting it, having aversion to it, being angry with it, which is just wanting to push it away, you greet it. You kind of like you welcome it, then you see it for what it is, and then you change your mind, you know. So we've got to become courageous. Anyway, I've just said a few things here. 10 to. I haven't stopped talking for 15 minutes. My goodness. So please now ask me some questions. Come on. Let's have some discussion. Any old thing, any direction.
I'll start to break the ice.
Okay, go.
I have two questions.
Yeah.
You were it sounded a little like you were saying that greed and anger are forms of delusion, like it's all delusion, or, you know,
Okay, let's be more precise in the use of the words, Norma. It's really good. They
yeah.
are, so attachment. So the three poisons, attachment. Okay, the root one is called ignorance in general, but we can refer to it at the more subtle level as ego grasping, this primordial, mistaken sense of self. Okay. The main voice of that is attachment, emotional hunger, dissatisfaction, manipulating, expectation. All of they are functions of this state of mind called attachment, a conceptual thought initially deep down that exaggerates the deliciousness of something. So when we're habituated with that, we have all that all those consequences. Emotional hunger, I'm not enough, must get some more. Then you manipulate, you expect, and it exaggerates the deliciousness of the object. So itself is, the words are, it is a delusion. It is an affliction, it is a delusion, or it causes us to be delusional. It causes us to be pulled from pillar to post by all the delicious things, believing when I get them, I'll get happy. And then you get them, and then, you know, and then you keep getting more and more, and then like with the cake, and then before you know it, you can't stand the cake or whatever. So attachment. And then aversion is the bare bones state of mind beneath what we call anger. But aversion, so a volatile level of aversion. And aversion is the response when attachment doesn't get what it wants. Because basically, attachment's a junkie. It's the most mean way to talk about attachment. It's this constant hunger to get what I want every single second. In its nature, it's self-centered. It's completely self-centered. You know, don't mix it with love and kindness and wanting to be a nice person. They're different. It's completely self-centered. It's frantic. It's desperate. And the millisecond attachment doesn't get what it wants, meaning in the kitchen, an unslurping husband is what attachment wants. The millisecond attachment doesn't get that. It turns into aversion. And the volatile level is anger. Milder levels are annoyed, irritated, frustrated. And then when it's internalized, it becomes depression and despair. So attachment and aversion, the bare bone states of mind. Do you understand? Attachment
Yep.
is all excited and wants to go towards something. Aversion panics and wants to go away from something. Then they have these different levels. Do you understand? They're the bare bones two main ones. 1,000 times a day, we're going between these.
Yes,
So,
that's so
you
helpful.
understand? So
I
attachment
do.
exaggerates the deliciousness and aversion exaggerates the ugliness. Do you
Okay, and speaking, I do understand. I think I understand.
understand?
Speaking of deliciousness, my other question is,
Yeah,
we are deluded in thinking that the cake will give us happiness.
yeah,
And when we have that first bite, we do feel some happiness. So the
yeah, definitely.
happiness
Yeah.
comes is that inner happiness that the Buddha was saying that we have, and sometimes the just objects of the world give us a taste of it, but
Okay, let's look at
happiness
it.
is internal, right?
No, no, let's look at it. It's a really good point. Let's analyze. This is really the best point to analyze. So when we understand, we have sensory consciousness, which is, remember the word consciousness and mind in Buddhism are pretty much synonymous. And so the sensory consciousness, to be very precise about it, the consciousness part is the mind, but it's that part of our mind that works through the medium of the eyeball, the eardrum, the skin, the physical body. The consciousness part is not the body, but it works with the body, and we have those five sense consciousness experiences. Do you understand? So this is a really good point. I bring this up a lot, but it's very sobering. We have a simple thing like, you'll see there's a pretty cup, there's a cup there, and you'll say, oh, what a pretty cup. So we will assume that because you're looking at that thing with your eyes, that your eye consciousness is seeing a pretty cup. Technically not possible. The sensory consciousnesses actually are profoundly limited in their capacity for cognition. So eye consciousness only has the capacity to cognize shape and color. So then you've got to ask yourself, well, what part of my mind is cognizing a pretty cup or an ugly sound, the slurping? Do you understand? That's your mental consciousness. That's where the workshop is. That's where the thousands of thoughts and opinions and viewpoints and feelings and emotions are. And they're completely separate parts of our mind, but we totally mix them. So the experience of a cake, your thoughts are making all sorts of stories. Your attachment is mental. It's creating a big fantasy story. It's believing the cake is more delicious than it really is. It really believes when I get it, I'll get happy. That's all the conceptual thoughts. That's your mental consciousness. But the taste consciousness, when it meets the cake, it definitely does trigger what's called a pleasant feeling. So now, Buddha's analysis of feeling, you've got sensory pleasant feelings, but you also have mental happiness. Happiness is another word for pleasant feeling, but there's sensory pleasure and there's mental pleasure. Now, our problem is we're addicted, and the first level is only the sensory. We mightn't even recognize a mental happiness. So we're totally addicted to getting the sensory. And the trouble is, and it's logical, sensory feelings can't be sustained. If you keep putting cake in the mouth, we know eventually you'll vomit. Even the best sex, excuse me being so gross, with the most handsome divine person in the universe, you will die of exhaustion if you keep having contact with that body. So clearly the senses are not the way to go to get happiness, but we think they are, and that's the tragedy. So when we start to realize that we have to train our minds in getting mental happiness, which comes from virtuous states of mind, it comes from compassion and kindness and love and patience and humility and giving up anger and giving up attachment. Mental happiness is finally what we're capable of. But we've got to be aware there's these very clear distinctions. So when you love somebody, not attached, when you're delighted in someone being happy and you have a happy feeling, that's mental pleasure. That's mental happiness. And we have to cultivate that. Do you understand? So even when even when you do get single-pointed concentration, they talk in the texts about, first of all, as your mind gets more subtle, you get this incredible bliss, and it's mainly sensory. But as you get more subtle, it eventually becomes mental pleasure, which is a billion times more profound. And the thing is, sensory pleasure cannot be grown. It's limited. It can't be sustained. But mental pleasure can be grown limitlessly. That's the point. That's what Buddha's talking about. Do you understand?
Thank you. Yes, that was beautiful.
Yeah, good.
Very cool.
Okay. But we have to see the distinction and focus on, because it's not, that's the thing, it's not punitive to say that sensory pleasure doesn't last. It's a fact, it's scientific. And if we only think that's the pleasure there is, which is the world, that's why we go around killing ourselves, because we just go crazy, we go mad. Because we don't know how else, we don't know how to get mental happiness. We just think it's all to do with getting a nice boyfriend, getting a house, getting this, getting that, and we're devastated when it becomes disappointing, because we've exaggerated its status. That's the tragedy, you know. So it's quite logical, really. We just have to hear it properly. You understand? So, any other questions, people? Anything at all?
I'm still not mute. Am I muted? Can you hear me?
I can hear you, Tom. Yes,
Okay,
talk to me.
perfect. Thank you. I was just getting messages that I was muted.
Yeah,
Thank you
no,
so
go.
much for this analysis. I just want to say that as you were talking, I was reminded that no one told us it's like listening to a fire hose. So don't try to take notes because it's going to pass you the moment. So I just really appreciate your wisdom and the forcefulness with which you're.
Good, Tom.
So
I'm so happy.
yeah,
It's important to be clear, isn't it? It's important to think freshly and look at it clearly. You know, it's so important, isn't it? We need,
absolutely, and it's very refreshing. And I have a question that
yeah,
and it may be just one of these semantic tangles that I find myself in.
yeah.
That when you talk about you need to get to know your mind, you need to recognize things. It sounds as if there's a separate entity. It sounds like there's this mind activity going on, and then there's something else that's kind of watching or
I
listening.
hear you. No, I do hear you,
What is
Tom.
that?
I do hear you, Tom, and it's a really good point, because this is touching on the business about what is the self, what is the I, what
Yeah, exactly.
emptiness, and we can get very entangled and caught up and twisted, but really it's not that complicated. I mean, it is difficult to hear it sometimes, so let's just analyze. Okay. So the mind is the term we can use to refer, very simply, to refer both to the sensory consciousness, but the one we're discussing here is the mental consciousness. So, as Lama Zopa says, where the workshop is. And that's basically all the thoughts and feelings and emotions. And as we know, even in Western psychology, it's like 1,000 thoughts a second. And they're all thoughts, you know, and all the feelings we have, this is a crucial point, the feelings we have, as we call them, they're all informed by being thoughts. So even if, you look at a person who's raging, I'm getting to your point, a person who's screaming and yelling, a child, and you can write down the words they say, you see a lot of emotion and their body is all shaking. But finally, it's all concepts, it's all words, but the body is shaking. The anger is the thoughts. I want to kill you. You are the cause of all my suffering. Because the emotional component is one thing, but it's the thought. So that's what we're discussing here. So now the point is, just as you said, I am looking at the mind. I see anger. So we use the term I, but the trouble is, this is now getting to emptiness. Can't help it. We give an over-exaggerated status to that I. It's just, think of it as a convenient label that we use to refer to all the bits and pieces of Tom. But there's no little piece in there that is called I. So if you just think of it as just, or put it another way, the Tibetans have a way of talking. When they're analyzing their mind, they say, well, there is anger, there is jealousy, there is love. They don't say, I am angry and I am jealous and I. So we keep the I out of the way, because the word throws us. So there is in the mind many, many parts of your mind. So you've got certain parts that are called the virtuous thoughts: love, compassion, kindness. You've got the neurotic ones: attachment, anger, jealousy. But you've got another lot, Tom, that they call them in a sense, they even call them like neutral, meaning they're not neurotic and they're not virtuous. But I like to call them the mechanical parts of our mind, and that's called concentration, good memory, intention, attention, discrimination. They're all the parts of your mind that enable you to function. Whether you're a murderer or a meditator, you need good concentration, good discrimination, good memory, good intention, attention. They don't have any character of being good or bad, but they're super important. So they are the parts of the mind that are the bits that are enabling what's called Tom to observe the other parts of the mind.
Yeah,
Do you see what I'm saying?
that's very helpful, because I was thinking that, so the part of the tragedies, let's say when somebody has like Alzheimer's or dementia,
Yeah,
it sounds like what you're saying is that those
it's a missing.
functional
Yeah.
things are impaired.
That's
And
right.
so,
They're the parts that are missing. They're the mechanical bits. And if they're all working properly, you know, but whether, see, that's the point, is whether you're a murderer or a meditator, you need those. Even the one called mindfulness, which we give a bit of a romantic notion to, it's simply the ability to not forget what you're doing moment by moment. Well, a sniper needs very good mindfulness. A thief needs very good mindfulness. So they are the neutral parts of our mind, or the mechanical parts that don't have the virtuous character and don't have the non-virtuous character. The key job of being a Buddhist is to learn to identify the distinction, or to distinguish between the weeds and the flowers, the neuroses and the virtues. And it's the good mindfulness, the attention, the discrimination, the intelligence, the concentration. All of those bits are what enable us to function, whether you're making a cake or learning to know your mind. They're the bits. So keep the eye out of it. There's but parts of your mind are all working to look at the other parts of your mind. That's the way to put it.
brilliant. Thank you so much.
Okay.
I thought I was
Good.
getting caught up in a semantic thing.
It's very easy to do that because we get the eye in the way and it gets complicated. Because it seems like there is a little watcher in there, but that's just it's just the name. We give it the name I to that, but it's just part of your mind. So the point is, why not each time? I mean, you can say, my hand is holding a cup, and it's true. But to be analytical, you say, well, the index finger's doing that, the middle finger does this, the ring finger does that. It's true, it's your hand. It's true, it's I, but which part of I? Well, intention is doing this, concentration is doing that, discrimination is doing that. Each bit does their job. So to home in on the details.
Okay, perfect.
You understand?
Thank you so much.
Good.
Perfect. Thank you.
Okay. So other people, any questions? And that's why we've got to have concentration, got to have shamatha, got to have, good concentration, so we can start to get to a more subtle level where the mind becomes super clear. So you can see all these parts working so clear and work with them in a very sophisticated way. That's the Buddhist skill, That's what we have to get to. Most of us won't get to that level of subtlety, but we can get somewhere, This Deborah had a hand up. Didn't you? Good, darling. Talk to me.
Hey, Robina. So a couple things. So the husband's slurping downstairs.
Yeah.
So as I come down, might I welcome the slurping, listen to the slurping in a different way, try to have compassion for the slurper?
This is the one that I know. So this is something. It's why such small examples are so helpful. We don't have to wait till you're being murdered before you start working on your mind, because it's just, if you start with the small things, and we can see all this, especially with people we live with, everything is so highlighted. And I've read people say that sounds coming out of the mouth are what people find so enraging. People want to kill each other with snoring and slurping, and you understand those, they make people completely crazy. So when you live close up to people, I don't know how you do it, sleeping in the same bed as somebody. I mean, that's why I remember reading the New York Times, one article about couples who've decided to have their own bedrooms. The miracle in their relationships, everything completely changed. That people began to discover who they really were by having their own furniture. They became more friendly to each other. They were more tolerant. Their whole life changed by just simply having their own bedroom. I mean, not out of aversion, but out of just being kind to each other, It's so interesting. Anyway, so yeah, it's really difficult. You got to be aware of where your mind is at. And if it's too pain, I mean, in the beginning, if we're not working on it, it's almost impossible to welcome the sound. But I mean, at least if it's only slurping the coffee, you know after 5 minutes it's going to end. So, do you understand what I'm saying? So, knowing that, and you don't want to shout and yell and have a fight, then you have to maybe, if you really can't handle it, put your earphones in or come back after 5 minutes. I mean, you've got to know what you can handle. Everything is really just simply is what can you handle, Of course, we all feel it's my right to say something to hubby, or I don't like it. We try to bully him into stop slurping, but that doesn't help. So it's like it was just slurping. That's not a simple example. But when it's constantly with people and kids, I mean, I don't know how people don't kill each other in families. It's so intense. It's so hard. That's why if you don't have a daily practice, I don't know how we can handle it. Anyway, I'm just chatting away. We have to know what we're capable of. It's really important. Isn't it?
Yeah, the slurping doesn't seem too bad, but like if it's a child that's really difficult.
I know. I can't imagine how people do it. It's extremely, I mean, when you talk, I mean, a friend of mine is a Buddhist for years, a lovely car, but he said he can't believe the amount of rage that his children bring up in him. I mean, I can imagine it. It's so intense. I can't imagine how people live together in families. It's really, and then you get so much guilt and fear and depressed because you think you're so hopeless and I can't imagine. It's an incredible practice, which is why I think, I mean, it's too difficult. But I know when as a kid, this is a simple example, there were 7 of us children. We didn't have enough beds. It was a kind of chaotic family, all sorts of other things happening, dramas. But it was like 7 little children sharing beds, rotating. Some had asthma, all had problems. And I mean, my problem was anger. So I'd be mean to my sisters. I'd put pillows on their head because they were like during the night they had asthma, And I put pillows on their head because I couldn't sleep. Talk about slurping. So all these intense experiences. And all I know is I thought of myself as a child and I was seen as volatile, rebellious, and angry. Well, I was so naughty in the end, my mother sent me to live at boarding school. Well, overnight, I became a saint, Deborah. Because suddenly the situation changed. I didn't need to be angry anymore. I'm not blaming anybody, but if we can know what we're capable of. So for me, it brought out the best in me. I studied for the first time. I had discipline. Everything changed overnight because suddenly I wasn't surrounded by my little sisters, not blaming them. So we have to know what we're capable of. We have to, and that's why for me, I think when you're living in a house with somebody, you've got to carve out a bit of space for yourself. I mean, this is the most self-respectful thing we can do. You've got to consciously do it. It's demanding too much of each other for people to live on top of each other all day and wonder why you get jealous and upset and fight. It's just too much to bear. It's too much to expect of ordinary human beings. It's so incredible sign of self-respect when you can carve out even a small space and you use that space. It's so intelligent, Do you understand, Deborah?
Yes. I mean, something I try to do is just relax my body and breathe and just try to be aware and say to myself,
that's part of it anyway, but I'm talking about something separate. That's not what I'm talking about. That's exactly practice. But before that, if you can be aware, I mean, say to me as a little girl, Robina, stop being angry. It would have been impossible. But put me in boarding school, in my own bed, in my own disciplined environment, I became this good person. So we can't, I mean, my mother didn't have the money to give her 7 children their own bedroom. You understand? We couldn't do it. But if we can recognize before you even start working on your mind, if you give yourself a physical condition that makes it easier for each other, it's incredibly important. Do you understand what I'm saying, Deborah?
I do. Yeah, I mean, the past 2 weeks I've been working on, my son is 21. He's in Peru. He's doing things like going to the desert by himself, camping out, and so I'm really working on my own anxiety because the truth is, if something happens to him, it's going to happen whether I'm anxious or not, right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. There you go. Well done, Deborah. That's one of the really good.
That's one of the good. My internet just froze.
No, that's really good, Deborah, because whether anxiety or not, it doesn't help. Easy to say it, but you got to say that to yourself. Exactly right. That must be very powerful for a parent. No, I understand that. Yes, that's a very good
It's
point.
hard, but I want to get to the place where I can accept that. And it's like,
That's right. Slowly, slowly. Keep working, girl.
okay, thank
Slowly,
you.
slowly. Good. Hello, Fiona.
Hi, Venerable Robina. It's lovely
Yes.
to see you.
Good.
Yeah, so my question, I'm curious if you could kind of go through an analytical deconstruction when one is faced with, one day some really intense political story that, makes you feel hopeless. The next day there's another political story that makes you anxious. Just this constant
Yes.
barrage. How do you analyze so you protect your mind? Like,
I understand. Exactly. I understand, Fiona. Well, see, the very first one, as I said before, is we have to know what we're capable of. I mean, and already, see, that's kind of difficult because that already demands some self-awareness. I joke, but not joke, that 40% of all women who get murdered on the planet are mainly murdered by the bloke in the same bed. And I'm not discussing this as a political issue. What I'm saying is it indicates the intensity of attachment, aversion, and the point I'm saying to Deborah, it also indicates we've got no sense of self-respect. We have no sense of boundaries. We have no sense of what we think is the right thing for ourselves. We have no idea what we think or feel. So we just absorb into each other until you kill each other. So what I'm getting at is we have to know where we're at. We have to know what we're capable of. So quite literally, if we have a panic attack, I mean, if you have a panic attack, if you hear about, the environment collapsing, if you have a panic attack, if you hear about politics, you've got to know that you've got to stop reading it. But we don't. We're like little addicts that keep reading and keep making ourselves crazy. So the very first one is to know what we're capable of. That already demands so much intelligence, and then know what we can handle. So if you can't handle going to that party where your drunk uncle goes berserk, you have to not go. But this is too difficult for us because then we get guilty. Oh, I shouldn't. And so I'm just talking one point. So now the other one is, the events of the world. I mean, sometimes, if you just looking at the paper and seeing, reading all the pictures and all these fires in Los Angeles, sometimes that can be overwhelming, even if you're not even in your home. You just can't bear the thought of those poor people and their suffering and all the houses burning down. It's just too difficult. So this is, whether it's the politics, whether it's that or whatever it might be, so the world is intense. Unbelievable things happen. We are totally exposed daily to every imaginable thing on the planet. So it's like extremely hard to deal with it. But so the analysis that I'm going to get to is this classic one of the Buddhist one of attachment and aversion. This is the analysis. The more we understand the workings of attachment and aversion, and these words sound so simple, but it's not, it's profound. So attachment, why we suffer when we see the bad political thing, why we have any anxiety, why we get angry, why we get freaked out, simply is because our attachment is constantly there. Its energy is only, the bottom line is, it only ever it's like a fragile child that can only cope with everything being lovely. That's the intensity of the suffering of attachment. We're like a fragile child that only can cope with nice things. Attachment just can't cope with anything going wrong. So the millisecond attachment doesn't get what it wants or gets what it doesn't want. The politics, the fire, the mean husband, you name it. Aversion is the immediate response. And aversion is a panic attack that is freaking out and wants to push it away. And either you get angry or you get anxious or you get depressed, whatever it might be. They're all aversion. So we go between attachment and aversion 1,000 times a day. And the driving force, everybody in the universe, including dogs and monkeys, this is Buddha's analysis, we're driven by this attachment, by this intense I-based, fear-based, emotional hunger to only get the nice things. This is the way to say it. So we have to learn to be brave in the face of attachment not getting what it wants. So if you literally can't handle it, you have to stop reading about the news. If you literally have a panic attack, if something happens, you have to be knowing what you can handle. But as we get better and better at knowing our minds, we get braver at literally not having a panic attack, at being able to look at the thing and then, depending on where you're at, if you're Buddhist view and you've got the view of karma, you explain it. If you've got the view of compassion, you'd have compassion. You'd use whatever view you can to explain it to yourself, and that keeps you steady. But it's not that easy. Of course it's not. But this is the basic analysis of attachment and aversion. Attachment and aversion 1,000 times a day. And then the other ones come as a result of these too. Are we communicating so far? Fiona? This is it, So, I mean, of course, it's normal and natural, but this is why Buddha goes into this stuff much more subtly than I think we do. But I think we can understand these words. Attachment is the main problem. And as we learn to, that's where you got to start with the hubbies slurping. Don't wait for the big dramas. If you can work on your mind at that small event, observe what your mind is thinking, observe the annoyance, the irritation, the aversion, the anger, mild anger, and you work as well as you can with it. And then you get more brave. And then when the bigger bad things happen, you're equipped to deal with it. It's like one step at a time, We've got to every day, this is what practice is. And the more brave we can become, I mean, when you get to the level of being these bodhisattvas, and it's good to use the example of people who've done the job. So if you get to the level of being a bodhisattva, where you really have given up attachment and aversion, you only have compassion. So they say, and they talk about the courage of these bodhisattvas. This is all just grist for their mill. They have no fears. They don't have attachment. They don't have aversion. They only have compassion. And this is seeing the suffering of the world encourages them to continue to work on themselves and to continue to do whatever they can to help others. But they don't lose the plot. But that's way to go, Do you understand what I'm saying, Fiona? It's good to hear about what you sort of like, when you start to play tennis, you don't even know what you're doing, but it's good to see the examples of Federer playing tennis so you know what you're capable of. Well, the bodhisattvas are the perfect example. They've gone beyond attachment and aversion and anxiety and panic and fear. They've given up ego. They only have wisdom and clarity and courage and compassion. I mean, how marvelous, And they don't get thrown. Everything they see is grist for their mill that increases their compassion, increases their courage. So all we can do is according to our capacity. Another way to talk, I like to think of this way. The wisdom wing work is really like the retreat mode. That's really the work of working on yourself, dealing with your own mind. It's not about compassion. It's all about you, like we're talking here. So when I read the news, let's say, I mean, I'm really into all my different, I always joke about it, and it's true though, I have all these subscriptions. You can tell I'm an old person because I don't do most social media. I mean, I go on social media. People put me on social media, but I don't even know how to get into them. But I read the Financial Times and the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal and the Vanity Fair. And what else do I read? Vogue, Vanity Fair, New Yorker, Financial Times, New York Times, Washington Post, a whole bunch. This is my addictions in the morning. I read all these things. I read views of the world. I like to read different views of the world. And so when I'm reading all this stuff, it's kind of, you get all this going on, all the dramas, all the things happening. And I like different views. I read the Wall Street Journal people. I read the Times, the New York Times, whatever. And then I'm just trying to be very objective about it. So what happens is when I read all about the crazy politicians, no need to say names, instead of having a panic attack, what we do is we give an interpretation. How dare he do this? Who does he think he is? Oh my God, all these politicians, that evil man. Then we have a mental breakdown. Instead of that, I use the wisdom wing approach, and I'll go, well, let's say it's Mr. Trump. I'll go, well, that's arrogance. I recognize that. That's anger. That's hubris. That's lying. I recognize each one. I'll go that, and I'll see it very objectively. And then I'll go, well, I recognize each of those. I've got those in myself. And then I say to myself, well, thank you for showing me how not to be. So I make it a learning for my mind. Now, another approach is to have the approach of compassion. So so to bring it back to yourself rather than, oh my God, look at these people. How dare this politician do this? We always act as if we're saints and everybody else is evil. But if you can kind of link it to you and go, I recognize that. I mightn't be a pedophile. I mightn't be a maniac, but I recognize the delusions. I recognize attachment, anger, jealousy, hubris. Tick the boxes. Then I go, well, then you don't panic so much. And then you realize as human beings, and you sort of, you can relate, you can sort of, you connect to it, in other words. That's one approach. The other approach is you can learn about karma. I mean, for me, I like the view of karma. Oh my God, look at that suffering. Look at the war in Russia. Look at the Ukraine. The karma of these people. It's so tragic. And then you have compassion. Instead of the analysis, and instead of the anger and the panic and how dare, that's what freaks us out. And the fact is, it's the world since beginningless time. We always act so surprised because attachment only wants everything to be lovely and delicious. So it's kind of like silly. We've got to be a bit more brave. This is the world. Why are we so surprised? Do you understand what I mean? Yeah. And if we can't cope, then we have to go to the mountains or do something. I mean, you've got to be reasonable. You've got to know what you can handle. If you can't handle you can't handle alcohol. No one thinks you're rude if you stop it. It's intelligent. If you can't handle reading the news, well, stop reading it. You've got to know what you can handle. We've got to know our own capacity, instead of being drama queens. Hello, Carol Ann. Talk to me.
Hi there.
Hi.
Thank you for sharing. I know that you have this background working in prison, and I'm working at a prison too right now as
Good. What do you do there?
a clinician. I do therapy.
Okay. Wonderful.
Yeah. And I find, the way that it's set up, one way is that there's a lot of this kind of scarcity mindset, comforts are not readily available.
Right.
And then the things that people do offer are not actually, there's drugs, right? There's lots of processed food.
Exactly, darling. Exactly.
Yeah.
So I understand that. They're such punitive places, aren't they?
Yeah. So I just
Right.
wonder, how through your work do you sort of work in that sort of extreme environment where it's like, okay, the brain just really wants some comfort, but we all know that it's like not going to actually be this long-term solution.
Exactly. And that's the thing. I think all we're talking here is the same. I mean, when I worked with people in prison in different countries too, it's the same talk. I give the same talking. So all you can say is that their experiences are far more vivid, that's all. They really can, but it's the same principle, the same teachings, the same approach, but it's just the suffering for them is just more, it's more blatant. And it's much harder. But I do find the many people I did work with in prison, some of the best practitioners I know are in prison because they really know they really know they don't have any choice. In prison, we can, even if we're struggling, even if we are poor, we can still manage to get a slightly nicer cup of coffee or something. But there's no freedom there. You cannot, mostly it's just, you can't get what you want. So you either live in total misery and frustration and anger, which is very common, as you must know, or you really know you're up against the wall, and so you are forced into your own mind and to practice. So some of the best practitioners I know are people in prison because the irony is in our culture, not in our culture, outside of prison, if you like, we always, it seems like we've got the option to leave something. But so if you're in a lousy job, theoretically you could leave it. But in the end, we end up not leaving it. And then we think, because you've really only got two options. You either, if you can't cope with a situation, you leave it. And if you decide you won't leave it, then the other option, you must change your interpretation of it. Well, prisoners don't have that luxury. So that the ones who really practice really work on their minds. So the irony is for us, let's say I come to you and tell you about my lousy job, and you say, I do understand, Robina, but you could leave the job. And I'll say, no, 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 why should I leave? They're the ones who are a problem. I'm not going to leave the job. And then you say, well, you could change your interpretation. No, 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 I can't do that. So in the end, we do neither. We just stay paralyzed. Do you understand my point? Because it's really, the brutal point is that anything, you either leave it or you change your mind. There's only two options. Prisoners don't have the luxury. They only have one choice: go mad or change their mind. Do you see my point? So in the end, I admire them for this reason. And so for me, when I talk, yeah. And I know I was just recently in prison in Sydney, and in Australia I was there. And I'm always moved by the ones in the prisons who are trying to practice, because they don't have any choice. They're stuck in these shitty places with lousy food, noise like you can't imagine, some of the ones who are, in lockdown. So when they hear these teachings, they're really moved by it, because they know they've got something they can do, Do you understand? I don't know. Anyway, that's all. That's a few of my thoughts, Caroline.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that.
So it's to have and it's easy to have compassion. You can speak with compassion to them, but to give them the courage to know that if they can't, and this is the essence. This is really the essence of the Buddhist approach. There's a saying: if you can change something, please change it. But what if you can't? That's the point. This is the brutal point. Then the part that we just can't get to. We just think, but it should change. And why doesn't it change? And he should change. We're full of shoulds and woulds and if onlys. But really, when it comes to it, if you can't cope with the job, you can't make it change, then you change your mind. They're the absolute options, no matter what the situation is. Do you understand? But we can't even come to terms with both. We can do neither. That's why we go mad. Do you understand my point? Yeah. Thank you, Caroline. Anybody else got something to say? Any questions? Time to go. Actually, it's time to go, isn't it? Look at that.
It is.
Time, 19 minutes gone like a dream. Wonderful. So anyway, I think nothing more to say. I think we had enough food for thought. So just the main one is, the key one is to try and see this Buddhist point. And this really does lead us to the most sophisticated teachings about understanding the true nature of how things exist, which is the teachings on emptiness. Is in general, the function of all the neuroses is they're painful, but they distort, they exaggerate. And that's the thing, when let's say with the dramas, even reading the news, if you look, even if I just like that example of just seeing the mind of the person, there is this, if you look it in the eye, and you deconstruct it, it dissipates the fear. And this really proves, if you do the analysis of the cake, when attachment is in there, freaking out, desperate to get that cake in the mouth, like a panic if you don't get it. That's how attachment is. If you just analyze it carefully, analyze the components, if you look the cake in the eye and go beyond the fantasy picture, it dissipates it. And that's very courageous. And that really proves emptiness. The things don't have this nature that we think they do. That's just a piece of advice also. Okay, darling people, keep moving. Keep practicing, have courage to know that our mind is super capable, that we can have the courage to look things in the eye and not lose the plot, and just keep moving. And then you have compassion for others because of it, because we're all in the same boat. Jang Chub Semchog Rinpoche, Ma Kie Panam Kegyu Chig, Kie Panyampa Me Payang, Gong Ne Gondu Pavashog. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, Noam. Much love, everybody.
Thank you,
See you.
Venerable. Love you.
Bye.